pleasure to be with you today, and welcome, David. Nice to have you. David Chandler, the Building Commissioner for New South Wales. And we have with us Chris Kerin.
I'm a solicitor that does a lot of work for owners corporations in terms of looking to get the rectification of defects in their buildings.
Yes.
And Ross Taylor.
Yes, and Ross Taylor. So my firm, Ross Taylor and Associates. I'm a specialist working in the area predominantly in defect prevention these days, but with a focus on waterproofing and improving designs to prevent defects. So we have, well, it's an interesting time to be able to get together because there's a ramping up of the Commissioner's activities. Of particular interest to people has been design and new buildings, but there's a whole area which is the remedial side, and a lot of customers, owners of buildings in the past have had quite a drama in getting the lawyers together and experts together to mount claims and trying to get some, what you might say, justice, if you like, against developers or builders. Very interested in what are the new provisions now to help owners in taking action when they feel they've been aggrieved by a builder or developer.
Well, Ross, as you will be aware, that there's been many pieces of legislation over the years that have been declared the ultimate curative, but they haven't really worked. And I liken it to being a bit like the graph in a Gartner hype cycle, where you have this aspirational goal and you all end up becoming disappointed. I think the industry arrived at that point about 2018-19, where our customers became so disillusioned at the fact that they were not seeing the sort of trustworthiness in buildings that they should have achieved. So the New South Wales government elected to pick up on a piece of legislation that was themed out of the Building Strong Foundations discussion paper that the Minister for Better Regulation circulated. And from that, firstly one piece of legislation then came forward, which was the Design and Building Practitioners Act, which you're aware is due to come into effect on the 1st of July this year. So it'll have quite a dramatic impact, but I'll explain the other piece of legislation, which is its companion piece. The Design and Building Practitioners Act has my powers in it, but it didn't bring my powers to the table until the 1st of July this year. So I would have really been sitting around with not much power in waiting for this piece of legislation to stand up. So the government agreed to bring forward the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act, otherwise known as the RAB Act, and that went through the Parliament at the same time as the Design and Building Practitioners Act on the 8th of June last year. Now, the Minister in his second reading speech made it clear that the government's intent was to stand this legislation up around Class 2 buildings because they were the ones that were causing the greatest grief in the marketplace. And the intent is that it could roll out to other asset classes in due course, but the mission here is let's turn this industry around, starting with Class 2 buildings, and that's where you and I have been doing a lot of work.
And that's the focus, is in terms of the high-rise buildings generally, rather than the low-rise or domestic ones. The high-rise buildings, the big concrete structures.
High-rise residential.
High-rise residential, where they have
multi-unit,
multi-unit, where they have the repetitive defects.
Correct. And so John Tansey was the author of the legislation. I really came on board in August 2019, and I would say that the legislation was probably 80% advanced when I came in. And so the Design and Building Practitioners Act really has two, in my view, critical pieces to change the way the industry works. It requires that accredited designers declare their designs for the key building elements of a building, so the structure, the waterproofing, the fire systems, the enclosure of the building, and the critical building services. So they're the ones that are causing the greatest grief in that particular sector. And at the end of it, the bookend piece then is that contractors have to declare that they've actually built the building in accordance with those declared designs instead of making it up. And we're finding on jobs at the moment is that basically the design didn't really mean much at the front end, and people have cut corners and made it up along the way. So it's quite a big pivot in what the government has done. Chris, you were correct in sort of saying that in a way this is very much a developer-facing piece, and as opposed to just simply the bit players. Because at the end of the day, as we were discussing on on this particular graphic, is that the pivot has in fact really shifted to developers and saying to them, look, you are the ones who sell an apartment to a consumer. You're the one that takes the deposit, and then once an occupation certificate has been achieved, you're the one then that receives the benefit of the sale price.
Yes. So they're in the driving seat, aren't they?
They are the ones that really, the old adage is that he who has the gold maketh the rules. Well, they're in the box seat to make the rules.
Yep.
And so one of the tactical pieces of the legislation is that if you can demonstrate that you can create some distance between the developer and the gold, then perhaps you get their undivided attention.
Yes,
so
yes.
that's where the RABs come, the RAB Acts come in,
Right,
and that is that we have these powers now under the RAB Act for me to go into buildings that are constructed, buildings that are under construction. I can call in documents, I can open up work, and I can issue orders to actually get that work rectified. And there are consequences for parties for ignoring any of those powers that I have. We're still standing those up, so I'm not going to say to you for a minute that everybody's finally worked out how that'll all function, but we're going through a test phase for that at the moment.
It's well underway.
In terms of under the Design and Building Practitioners Act, you've got to get the designers registered, and that presumably has to be done by the 1st of July when the second part of the Act comes in. How's that coming along?
Well, that's required a rebuild of the government licensing platform, and that's well into advance now. So, look, it'll be under pressure for the first few months, as you can imagine. It's a very big technology build, but don't forget that the Act really applies to buildings that are yet to achieve a construction certificate from the 1st of July. So it's not every building coming over the fence on day one. So I think there'll be a lead up, and I think the technology will really play an appropriate time to match the demands of the legislation. It's a good question you ask, because this is an amazing period of time to be able to do legislation while technology is changing so quickly. We're 20 years into this century, and it's just amazing that we are now benefited with very powerful stuff. So in the regulations under the Design and Building Practitioners Act, for example, there's a piece of real estate in the bottom right-hand corner which I own going forward, which is a DWG drawing input, which basically says that very, very bottom right-hand corner of all drawings will actually be a piece of real estate that the regulator will use to actually do its job in future. So a declaring designer will need to go out to the licensing platform and be confirmed that they're able to upload, and then when they upload there'll be a one-time digital chop that will actually go into that DWG, which gets away with all the traditional drawn by, checked by, it's just straight out declared by. And similarly, when the constructor at the other end starts to do that, they'll go off and confirm who they are. They'll also get a one-time digital chop, and up it goes, and it will sit in the same little piece of real estate.
So of the thousands of builders and developers out there, how many people know about this coming into force on the 1st of July, do you think?
Well, we've tried pretty hard to get this out across the industry, and as you know, it's a difficult communications job. So I think we've still got the majority to communicate to. So some are going to learn the hard way, and some are simply discovering it because this is now in the news and they're hearing it more and more. I think the most impactful piece of work that we're doing is during the occupation certificates audits that we're currently conducting. Already we're being able to exhibit to developers that if there is a disconnect between the designs that projects are allegedly being made to and the way they're being made, there's an immediate consequence. So in the last 2 weeks I've been out on 3 occupation certificate audits where it became very clear as we were walking into the building that we were saying to the builder, did you build it this way? And the answer was, Commissioner, no, I've built it that way. And it was really quite unrelated and inappropriate alternate construction. So we elected to stop the audit and basically say to the developer, go away and present us with a set of drawings that reflect what's built. And if the designer's not happy to reflect what's built in those drawings, then to issue instructions to the builder to make changes to what's built such that they're then prepared to put on those drawings what's built.
Yep.
Now that is really dropping a big stone in the pond, because suddenly people are realising that the days of half-cooked documentation, and we're going to get to that, Ross, as we talk about waterproofing, because we can now move to a situation where we understand why we're focusing on waterproofing. It is, as you can see from the dashboards that we're starting to produce for our own program monitoring, is that you can see from the dashboards, in fact, that waterproofing is the standout fault line in the buildings that we're inspecting. And of course, the work that you've been doing for the last, let's say, 20 years to be kind, is predominantly seeing waterproofing.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about that data, that's probably incidences, I imagine, yes? In terms of the audits, incidences which are classified as waterproofing. There's another interesting number that I think would be wonderful, which is in my experience, is that, so that say that number is 50% of defects are waterproofing, we generally find that they are, in the work with Chris Kerin on defect claims, is it's more like 80% of the dollar value of defects is what we find. So its repercussion seems to be larger, because once you get a leaking bathroom, you get one leak in a bathroom, and it's a $20,000 chop out of a whole bathroom.
I'm not entirely convinced that that is the biggest cost. I think it's the biggest cost that actually gets addressed. So I think what we need to focus on is that, we're just about to step into, say, the cladding remediation for flammable cladding in New South Wales, and I think that will always trump the cost of waterproofing. And I don't think anybody really has looked at the implications of some of the structural issues that we're finding, and I think they could come close. So you can see in our conversations that that structure's not far behind waterproofing. So I just think that what's happened is that there's quite a number of things that have had low visibility, and had they had more visibility, they'd be more part of the conversation. So I'm not going to simply subscribe to the fact that by a long margin the cost of waterproofing remediation is the big issue.
I suppose what we're reflecting on is cases that have been held over these last 10 or 15 years, the court cases that are coming up, is that seems to be reflected. But certainly there are these other sleeper issues.
I think that's right, Ross. And and it could be argued that in fact the things that have actually been litigated were simply the edge of it. It only dealt with those things that became the bleeding obvious, as opposed to those things that were still the sleeper.
Just to that point, interested in what with these the legislation that's come through and the regulations, what will be the impact of that, or the repercussions for getting builders and developers to come back and fix things? Obviously, we've seen in the past that builders are very prepared to come back and do cheap fix-ups, and obviously put a lick of paint over something. But for the serious dollar value issues, how does the new legislation and regulation assist customers with that?
Well, Ross, under the RAB Act, of course, once we've identified a particular matter that's a serious defect, we then invite the developer or builder to confirm that they acknowledge that and that they would undertake to rectify it. Right. Of course, we can use that by them agreeing to do that without any pushback, or we've actually got the push that can overcome the pushback. So we'll work with the players to achieve the best way forward. What I'm finding on a number of projects, and let's call them the legacy projects as opposed to the future projects, they're the ones, Chris, that you people run into, we call them the legacy projects, is that the scale and frequency of them is distorted by the fact that I call them as though they have a washing machine problem, is that you get the colours and the whites mixed up together in the machine, and you think you've got a bigger load than you have. So what we're narrowing this back to is to say that we're going to focus on the serious defects in the common property. So that's the structure, the waterproofing, the fire systems.
That's great.
Okay, so we can, I want to cleanse the load. We're putting everything into the machine and mixing it up. Yes. And one of the problems that we're seeing in the litigations is that quite often the litigation is driven by process, not by understanding what the outcome's going to be. So when I ask some lawyers, not all, but some. What's this look like at the end? Well, basically, a judge will award a pile of cash, we'll take our bit, hand over the balance to the owners corporation and leave. Well, that's not necessarily it. So under the RAB Act, one of the tools that is available to us is to issue building works rectification orders. Now, when we do that, we'll be looking to have the responses to that not by the builder simply defining what needs to be done and then self-managing it. So I'm about to enter into some enforceable undertakings where we actually set up the governance arrangements for performing that work.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
So just explain that a bit more. So rather than issue a rectification order, you ask for an enforceable undertaking?
We see issuing both a combination of building work rectification orders and prohibition orders being appropriate on both sides of the occupation certificate. So it gets everybody's attention because once we issue them, they actually have to be published on the Fair Trading website. So immediately that starts to provide another layer of care to consumers by saying, beware, because that project's got some orders issued to rectify it. So what I'm actually finding now is that quite a number of developers want to quickly come to an agreement as to how do I lift the order. So, but there's two ways of going forward at that point. We might get pushback from a developer or a builder saying, no, I don't think that's a serious defect and I'm going to push back on that. Well, that's where the Land Environment Court can go, and of course that can be very expensive, it can take time, and it in itself is not necessarily going to make the customer right. So on the other side of that, I've got soft powers, which allows me, as an alternate to using the hard powers which we've just discussed, is to call the parties to a conciliation conversation to say, look, let's agree that the defects are the defects, and we want to do this as a painless way as possible for both parties, for both the responsible developer builder and the owner's corporation, because litigation's a very expensive way to get to the end. So we're currently preparing a template form of voluntarily entered into enforceable undertaking.
Right. And do they appear on the register?
They don't need to, because the ones that will go on the register will be those ones that are imposed by going the hard way. So take it to the Land and Environment Court, get to the other side and it's still there, then it's going to stay there. Whereas another way of doing it would be to sit down and say, well, let's have a conciliation conversation, and we'd enter into a voluntarily entered into enforceable undertaking. And for those parties that want to do that in good faith, I don't see that it's in the public interest to actually publish those. So we've actually agreed that in principle we'll treat those as confidential agreements.
So whatever ends up on the register stays on the register?
If someone's going to really want a pushback and a hard way to this, then it's going to hang around for as long as it takes. But we've already got a situation where the first rectification order, building works rectification order, and the first prohibition order were issued on a project in Caringbah in October last year, very shortly after the powers were there. And the great thing there was that the developer stepped up and said, yep, I agree, all those things, they need to be done. I'm going to get on and get them done. So we were able to lift that order before Christmas and take that away from it. Okay, so it doesn't need to hang around if the order is lifted. So we lifted the order before Christmas, and the residual piece there was that the certifier just had to certify or observe those final pieces that we had agreed to make sure that they were done before the OC was issued. So we asked the certifier to write a notice to the developer to say, I won't issue your OC until these final things are ticked. And we then left it in the hands of the parties, because we don't need to be in the face of everybody all the time. We got a good outcome there.
I mean, it looks like, just looking at the register here, that there's been an acceleration of orders that have been issued in the last month. Are you kind of gathering pace and becoming more active? I mean, the outcomes of your investigative powers is now becoming apparent. We're now going to see a lot more orders. Is that the direction?
Chris, it's a good observation. Let me just put a context around that for you. On the 1st of September, developers had to notify me that they were within 6 months of achieving an occupation certificate. So within the first 2 weeks, we had 470 notices of intended occupation certificates being achieved within the next 6 months.
Yeah.
There were 220 that were expected in the first 2 months.
Wow.
So we were standing up a resource,
Yeah.
and we had at that time 15 inspectors. We're now 25,
Yeah.
so we got the right resource mix. But in that period of time, we really needed to quickly look at those that we felt had some issues and intervene.
Yeah.
Now, we're not keen to intervene lightly. We want to make sure that people see what we're doing as being considered and measured. So some of that early time frame wasn't as luxurious as you'd like to have.
Yeah.
So we've just completed the selection of the April site selections for audits.
Yep.
And so we've now set a parameter that says from the 1st of March, we now are looking into those that have got 6 months to go.
I see, right.
Okay, so we've now set a marker that says we won't select anything now unless it's got an extraordinary pick me message coming from it
Yeah.
that's got less than 3 months to go.
Yeah.
And by the middle of the year, we hope to only be selecting those projects that have got 6 months to go.
Yeah.
Because the whole idea of the OC audit is not to be a blocker, it's to be just simply something that we can do as the last 6 months of a project works out, that we can then say to a developer, look, here is your score on those on these things of the critical elements, and we provide quite a detailed list under red, amber, green, and they get a dashboard for their project to say, these elements, here's the dashboard score that you've got,
Yeah.
but behind that is a report that says for each of those elements, there's quite a long list of things, if that's a long list, of those things that need to be navigated. Now we say to the developer, first of all, here is a draft list of the issues that we think. What do you think? And so far, 90% of the developers have come back and said, yep, so we agree that those things need attention and we will now get onto them.
Yeah.
So at that point, we would issue a BWRO just to say, well, you know, let's be clear that we're serious,
Yeah.
and potentially a prohibition order to make
Yeah.
sure that we're really serious. 90% of developers are simply saying, yep, they need to be fixed. We wouldn't be happy with that, and frankly, we're a bit ashamed as to why we've ended up that in the first place.
Yeah.
Our goal then is to sort of drop in on that developer every month or two,
Yeah.
do a quick review of the things that we think are super important,
Yeah.
give them another report and refresh their dashboard.
Yeah.
And if the dashboard's sort of going from red amber to amber green, then we're all starting to feel pretty good about it.
Yeah.
But if it hasn't shifted from amber red, then we're starting to flag
Yeah.
you're likely to run into some delay at the other end of this. So that message is getting through quite well.
So the investigation piece is clearly where the action is. How do you, when you get the notifications, the expected completion notices, how are you deciding which ones you're going to visit?
Again, a good question, because some people in the industry have thought that you only needed to incur my wrath, and that was the way to do it. And of course, you don't build a robust system around a particular individual's view of the world. But it's fair to say that perhaps the first cohort of projects picked themselves. So you know, let's be frank about that.
Yeah.
They really picked themselves. They were from a cohort of developers that have had a track record of leaving some poor examples behind.
Yeah.
They were from certifiers who've had a track record of certifying some pretty ordinary buildings.
Yeah.
And we've started then to add a bunch of other metrics.
Yeah.
A very interesting metric that we've been using in the new risk analysis is a builder who has a high number of safe work rectification orders during the construction process is most likely to be someone who is not overly enthusiastic about compliance of construction.
Right.
So
There's a correlation.
there's a real correlation. And so about December, we actually looked at a list of potential candidates, and we saw that if we lined up the top 20 builders in New South Wales building Class 2 buildings by the highest number of safety rectification orders during the construction period, 20 down to, or 1 down to 20, they lined up with a cohort of certifiers. Almost exactly, you could pick the fact that 5 certifiers were going to line up somewhere between that 20.
Yes.
So the risk we've run, of course, is that if that's the only methodology for selection, then we run into a bias in the way we select.
Yes.
So we needed to create some other metrics that brought in geography, scale. We've got very powerful data analytics. If anybody thinks for a moment that the power of the data analytics available to a regulator these days is like it was 20 years ago, they'd be dreaming. It has changed dramatically.
There was some talk about a rating system for builders. Is that happening, or?
Yes, that's a work in progress. So we went out to market to see if we could actually get a market response to ratings.
Yeah.
And we only got one response, and it wasn't really at the level we thought that it would be. We had industry on the tender assessment panel for that, and both us and industry felt that in fact what was submitted really wasn't going to work for us.
Right.
So we agreed to not proceed with that tender. In parallel with that, we've internally built an extraordinarily powerful ratings capability through what we call a single view of building tool.
Yeah.
And that is really joining up data sets that have never ever been joined up before.
So will this be available to the public, or it's just internal?
At the moment, what we'll do is we'll push on with that being the regulator's data set, but what we're still keen to do is to create a market-facing ratings process. So what we've done in parallel is said, okay, let's get our own internal capability in place, but in parallel with that, now let's sit down with the development industry and actually look at what are the characteristics of a trustworthy developer.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that's come through from our own data analytics is that by and large, many of these, all projects are done through a special purpose vehicle. So
Yes.
we do need to understand that SPVs are in fact a legitimate form of procurement. So there's no way in the world that we should say that the devil of the world is SPVs. The big challenge is the governance of each SPV.
Yes.
So when you look at the good players who use SPVs, and I'll mention, say, someone like Mirvac, who would use an SPV, but they install in their SPV corporate governance as well as independent governance. So the transaction between the developer and the builder in making the building has proper governance over it.
Yep.
In the ones that we think are the less trustworthy SPVs, we can see that one director could be a director of up to 80 SPVs and no governance.
Yes. And you've got that power to actually make a director personally liable. Have there been any circumstances where you've considered looking at that, or?
Well, they're downstream sorts of powers, so they're 6 to 10 years away when you think about it. So, I mean, we're sort of laying the foundations for what's going to be there in 6 to 10 years. I don't really want a situation where the only curation for owners corporation is the liability of a director, because they may be a man of sand by that time. So I think we're far better off playing the game at the front end of the bus. So I think those duties of care and all of that are nice to have, but I think the most important thing is that we get developers to understand you made the promise, you've got to deliver the goods, and we're going to have a look at you at that critical point where owners convert from depositor to owner.
I think one of the themes I've seen through Construct New South Wales, I think is very engaging, is that of the concept of accountability. And it seems to be at the heart of this question of developers, is saying who has got the control on and the ability to do it right or do it wrong, and bringing the legislation and the regulations to those actors at that time and saying you're accountable at this phase or this phase, that phase. Would you like to just enlarge on accountability as a theme?
Well, Ross, that's a very core piece of the challenge that we're addressing in changing the culture and the behaviour of the industry. So we think that one of the areas of accountability has to be through professional associations to start with. So Engineers Australia, the certifiers through AIBS, through AAC, and we're putting an enormous amount of pressure on those associations to become accredited under a professional standards scheme. Because then what we've got is some co-regulatory collaboration that can go on. At the moment, professional associations are a voluntary membership club, and they don't really play much of a role other than at the front end saying, oh, the university should have these courses to accredit engineers.
Yes.
We create a pipeline of engineers,
Yes.
and at the other end of the pipeline, those ones that shouldn't be coming out the pipe, they take no responsibility for extinguishing. So accountability
Yes.
of professional associations is the biggest piece of work.
Yep.
I'm really pleased to see that Australian Institute of Building Surveyors, their achievement of a professional standards rating was put on notice by the Professional Standards Council yesterday.
Wow.
So they should have that by the end of the year. Now the really great thing for their members is that they then start to resolve the next wicked problem of the industry, which is professional indemnity insurance, because once you're in a professional standards scheme, you can have capped PI. And so one of the problems that the insurance industry is saying is, because you've got no way of containing this thing called the risk and the PI, it's a sort of just out of control piece.
Yep.
If you can get the key players, the certifiers, the designers, the engineers, to actually get themselves into a professional standards scheme and achieve cap PI and become more self-regulatory, more accountable of the membership, then in fact you start to change the landscape. So we're working on that.
As a lawyer looking at that, I mean, we have capped liability under that sort of scheme, and I've always wondered about why engineers and other professional associations haven't adopted that. You're suggesting that all engineers will need to become a member of some association, not necessarily the Institute of Engineers, but some engineering association, and that's the aim. Everyone will be a member.
We hope that the professional associations will become professional.
Yeah.
So our goal is to work with them, to help them, to mentor them, and to show them the benefits of achieving a professional standards rating.
Yeah.
It's terribly important that they do, because at the moment their members are going through extortionate prices for insurance policies.
Yeah.
Insurance Council of Australia, and we're working very closely with them to try and deal with this. It's no good just simply legislating to say, you shall have PI, because if that's an open-ended question, well, the insurers are saying, well, that's fine, but we don't have wood duck written on our head.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to be in the business. So in Australia and New South Wales in particular, for every dollar of premium that's written right now, the cost to the insurance industry is about $1.23.
Right.
And it needs to be about 55 to 60 cents, because when they put the other pieces on top of that, which is the distribution costs, the administration costs, so there's about a 70 cents in the dollar gap between the viability of PI that's available in the marketplace. Now, we immediately provide some relief to that spectrum of risk if we get more people into a cap PI framework.
Okay. Yeah.
Why is there resistance to that? Is this disorder, or?
I think that it's not a cheap exercise to do that. I mean, first of all, and it needs to be done in conjunction with the regulator, because it will require a piece of complementary legislation to say, well, in recognition of this, we can probably ease this or that.
Yeah.
So you'll see in the regulations for the Design and Building Practitioners Act that there's a couple of options for being in the industry. So for those that are not in a professional standards scheme, we're sort of going to drive up the amount of CPD you have to do. So there'll be a point where they say, enough. We'll put our efforts into becoming a professional organisation, because, you know, engineers particularly hold out to the community that they're the most trusted player in the game.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I'm seeing examples of them being the most compromised. It's not so much about their desire and capability of doing good things, but they accept compromised engagements. They do shorthand designs. Not that that's what they want to do, but they're prepared to accept a compromised engagement.
Yeah.
They're prepared to accept a compromised scope of project delivery observations, the checking. And so if you add both of those together, what you end up with is, when they're confronted with having to issue a certificate of compliance for the structure, for example, at the end of the project, it can be nothing else other than compromised.
Yeah.
So
You combine that too with the increased complexity, where you've got an engineer for horizontal bits and an engineer for vertical bits, structurally, and PT, for example. you get three or four, the intersection of three or four structural engineers into the one detail, which happened in one very famous case. So there's increased complexity as well.
And we're probably on the way to your main theme for today, but the sorts of things that I'm seeing is that because engineers have accepted compromised designs, then they don't have any, I guess, capacity to entertain multidiscipline design integration. So what we're finding is that engineering designs are being issued for construction that haven't been benefited with multidiscipline design integration. And where I see, and you see that, you've been with me out on site, Ross, is where we've seen it, is that a whole basement has been built and they've left out the drainage pipes beneath the basement slabs. And the first telltale that you have is massive saw cuts across the basement where they've had to saw cut these things in, and they've cut right through the basement slab and broken the back of the basement slab. So it's this piece of, you were talking about, I mean, I like your idea that, you know, the first thing that you should ever put on a drawing is the downpipe. I'm 100% in your space.
That's it. So yeah, what we've been finding, I suppose we've gone from the picture of the public in the past was the whole problem of the industry was shonky builders, But in fact what we find is, and in our experience in defect analysis and forensic side of defects, is that 80–90% of the causes originate in design. Now, that design, it might be actually a lack of connection or integration of the designers, as you just mentioned, or it could be that the design's so hard to build that it generates a fault on site or generates a redesign on site on the run.
A workaround, some form of workaround. And
this is one that we looked at together, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Which is in a building before it opens.
Correct.
Yeah, and so you have water pouring out of a joint. But in terms of integration of design, or I suppose it's that siloing we have in modern, with emails, is that everybody can be and send emails and never meet each other. The critical thing for avoiding these sort of defects is that there is an integration of a structural engineer, architect, and in my field, waterproofing, hydraulic engineer, that they meet and they integrate their design. Because
I mean, let's come to this one, because this is a great example, but one of the things, of course, that was going to solve all this for us was BIM. And sort of here we are, building information management systems. So these are these new design platforms. Now, that's been around 30 years. And except for very high-end jobs, I can see no benefit of the capacity or the intent of that sort of integrated design platform. And a lot of that's really regulated by the fact that there's a big issue over IP, of actually who owns the bit that's put in and who's responsible. So IP is a real big issue, but BIM hasn't been the panacea.
It hasn't. I just was in a review.
Didn't solve that, did it?
So we have a look at an example like this one, where it's a fairly harmless sort of a thing. It's a planter box in the middle of a podium of a building that's about to open in 3 weeks. Yes. So the trees are going in, the membranes being on the feet of underneath that gentleman nearby, and membranes being laid down to waterproof the podium or car park underneath.
And there's a great excitement with the developer that the gold is nearby.
Right, and hurry up, guys, because we've got to open in X days, because there's a bunch of owners want to get them. We want to get the money of the owners. Actually, I think it's more like
there was a little gap, wasn't there?
There was a little gap, because when we came on board, we then said, hold on, that membrane there's this big joint going underneath, which David actually identified first. See, that big joint is running under that planter box and disappearing, and it will forevermore have a watering system on it. And that was closely related to that water in the basement we saw before. Then we go to the drawings and we say, but hold on, what's on the drawings? And we go to the structural drawings and we see an expansion joint right at that point, which then ducks and weaves under the planter box. We then asked the question, because they're very big slabs, what is going to be the shrinkage or the opening up of that joint over 10 years? And they came back with the answer of 18 millimetres. And they've got a membrane going across it, which is about 0.6 of a millimetre thick, that's being asked to do all that work. So the integration of design, architect, hydraulic engineer, and in this case, like in this case here, well, there's more of that example. But on the same building, we see integration where there's no falls in this concrete, but we do have an architectural drawing.
That you just had up there, Ross, is an example. The fact is that joint from end to end was nearly 100 metres long.
Yes.
And so the rectification costs for the developer before the job was finished on that particular instance,
Yes.
I'm told, is close to $100,000. So by the
Yes.
time they reformed that joint
Yes.
and they reinstalled it, including,
Yes.
you can see these holes that were drilled in at your advice,
Yes.
because the joint was never going to work the way it was.
Yes, and the interesting thing for that builder is he has now instituted new practices because he saw that there is information on that's not on the drawings for them to plan around and design around, and so they're looking at integrating those designs and changing their practices. So it's a positive outcome.
Well, it's fitting into our message, isn't it, Ross, that the cost of building it right is a darn sight cheaper than building it again.
Yes, because we're seeing about 100 to 1 factor, and this is a good example.
It's a good example, Ross.
Yeah. So just in integration, we see the same thing with things like a fall indicated on architectural drawing, but it's a flat line. And similarly, there's a flat line on that concrete slab at that roof. And so the guys that get the job, and this is this issue we talked about before of engineers not so much necessarily being negligent, but they're being compromised. So the engineer didn't have the money to meet with the architect to have a workshop to work out how those falls were going to be achieved.
It's quite interesting though, Ross, that there's sort of a bit of a history to that, because traditionally architects took responsibility for the top of the slab,
Yes.
and engineers took responsibility for the profiling of the underside of the slab.
Yes. Yes.
The reality is that engineers should own both sides of the slab,
Yes.
because that's the important piece of the building.
That's right. So that's then a question of the outside, the end performance is it just about holding structures up, or engineers should be engaged to be looking at bigger questions like how the water is going to get off the building. So when the accountability issues come in and we have a look at these things, then engineers will get more engaged in it and asked to be more engaged in it, and developers need to pay the engineer to be more engaged in that integration.
Well, there's consequences for good choices and bad choices, aren't there?
And that's what we've seen plainly. Yes. So you've carried out, or you've completed about...
Well, we've commenced 36 audits. In fact, it's more than that now. It's about 46 audits, but we've done 37 pre-OC audits.
Right.
And of course now we're doing audits of legacy buildings, because there'll be so roughly our efforts are going into about 70% into coming OCs, and about 30% is saying, well, let's go back now and see what we can do with some of these legacy buildings. So we're not going to solve the world, but we're going to go back and do something.
There would be many lot owners out there who would be intrigued to hear that you're looking at legacy buildings. What do you have to do to get on that list?
So that's a really good question. Chris, you've got your finger on it, on the very critical questions we need to note. So let's be clear. We're redesigning the way that the Building Regulator's Office works, the Office of Fair Trading. So what we've now done is we've split the points where defects in buildings can be lodged. So we've got one port now where you can register serious defects in the common property,
Right.
and we've separated that from the other port, which is defects in the lots.
Right.
So we see defects in the lots. So, you know, the common property goes a long way into a lot, so people need to understand.
The vast majority of the building is common property.
Correct. So, for example, up until the surface of the tiles, and we're going to look at that in a second, up to the surface of the tiles is in the common property.
Yeah.
And most people haven't thought through what is in the common property. So we have set up a portal through which we will receive purely complaints about serious defects in the common property, and the others will go off to another part of Office Fair Trading, which will deal with more the consumer type issues. The trouble we've seen with a lot of the litigations that I've been looking into at the moment is that if I call the common property the whites and the lot issues the coloureds, they're all in the same washing machine for the litigation, and it's causing litigation to be much more expensive
Yes.
than it needs to. So owners corporations can now advise Office of Fair Trading of serious defects in the common property. The critical rule here is that the person must be an authorised representative of the owner's corporation.
Yeah.
So we will not take a complaint from a lot owner, particularly one who's aggrieved about their executive committee. So if you are a lot owner and you have a scratch on your bench top, yes, we will receive that complaint, but that'll go off to where the jugs and kettles go off to in that part of the consumer side of fair trading, and we will focus on the other.
Wonderful.
So is that a marrying up of the complaint system that's existing or pre-existing, where you had a problem and then they appointed an officer who would then get the parties to meet on site and so forth? Or is it a separate thing?
We're going to be a lot more proactive in these complaint management going forward. So, my job has been to come in and do an assessment of the current state of the regulator and be involved in what we call a transformation of the regulator. Historically, I would say that 80% of the resources of the regulator were what I call from the back of the bus.
Yeah.
That was in the 4 to 6 year after a building had been built, and very, very little effort at the front. By the end of 2022, 80% of the regulator's effort will be from the front of the bus in the sorts of things we're doing at the moment.
So what sort of things are you finding in these audits? What types of issues? We've got the big headings there in that dashboard. What are the sort of defects that you're finding?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do, Ross, is to marry up cause and effect.
Yes.
So we've discussed cause being poor governance of the SPV and the relationship between the developer and the builder, particularly where the developer and the builder are an in-house entity. There's no separation there. So when we can now see clarity that there's likely to be more serious defects where there's been no governance between the SPV developer and the in-house builder.
Right.
And so a clear message to developers got to be, you need to sort that out, because we're going to land on that sort of problem all the time. We've discussed the relationship then between good outcomes and incomplete design. Yes. So if we see incomplete design going in, yes, we expect to see poor quality. So yes, when we get on the ground, and you've been on the ground with me a couple of times, is that we always go to the basement, because I have a rule that basically says you can pick the DNA of a building by a walk around the basement. So we walk around the basement, and generally we are disappointed on 60 to 70% of projects that we go into. I've got over 5,000 photographs I've taken on the OC inspections I've done. I've been involved in 65 full inspections on the job, so it's not as if I'm making commentary from a small sample. Yeah. So we then indicate that we want to walk from the basement to the roof. So we don't go up in the lifts, we actually walk up the fire stairs, because the fire stairs are the second indicator of DNA. Yes. If you've actually got a shocking quality of finishes in your fire stairs, yes, then that's telling me the next thing is the DNA of this thing, yes, is ringing consistent. Yes. So then we arrive on the roof, and Ross has been up on the roof with me on a number of projects, and we can predict that what is in the basement is exactly where it'll be mirrored on the roof. Yes. So if anybody wants to think that all we want to do, and you might recall the first couple of jobs, they were saying, Commissioner, come and have a look at the display suite. It's fantastic. Right? The last thing I want to see is the display suite. Yeah. So we do the basement, we go up the fire stairs, we do the roof, yeah, and then on the way out we might drop in on a couple of floors, yeah, and have a look at some of the units.
Well, what about the bathrooms there where they say, oh, here's our finished bathroom, doesn't it look nice? And they're a little crestfallen when we say, actually, we're going to take up a tile there and there.
Well, we're benefited by looking at a slide that reminds us of that experience, yeah, Ross, and this is not something that's limited to just any one end of the developer-builder market. I have to say that we've seen this now with Tier 1 builders. So, for anyone to believe that this is all about them and not about us, yep, there's some Tier 1 builders that need to lift their game, yes, as well. Yes. So invariably, I sort of say, guys, what am I going to find in your bathrooms? Oh, Commissioner, we've done a great job. We've used 100% stuck tiles, and yeah, yeah, I do tap, 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 and yes, it doesn't sound like 100% tiles, so we, yeah, pull a couple off, and yeah, suddenly we find they're spot stuck, and yeah, then we pull them all off, and I think we're up to about 1,000 bathrooms we've stripped so far. Yeah. So we're not embarrassed at all about saying all off.
Yeah, that's right, and so they understandably get worried. But this is actually one of the aspects of this, back to our earlier conversation, this is an example of design that leads to workmanship defect. Because they hadn't thought through the alignment of the wall panels and the tiles with other finishes, the tiler then had to build it out with dobs of goo, and so that he didn't use up so much. And suddenly we have this cascade of defect that arises, but it originates so often in design.
Correct. It's a compounding of what we call the fault line. So yeah, if the fault lines start with the fact that there's a lack of falls,
Yes.
And then there's a compromised membrane.
Yes.
And then we find that on top of that there's compromised installation of tiles, vertically and horizontally.
Yes.
You can see that one thing adds to the other,
Yes.
and you end up with a calamity. So we know on that project that we both went into, you could argue that the developer may have saved about $1,500 a bathroom by the shortcuts that you and I saw there.
Yes.
We know that when that developer went back and pulled out 370 bathrooms by agreement with us to repair them, we estimated that they spent about $15,000 a bathroom, which is 10 times the original notional saving. But you and I then know that had that not been picked up and a consumer had to deal with that in a year or two down the track, we estimate that was $35,000. Right, so what you can start to see is that whenever we intervene here and get a correction at the front end, then what you're going to see is that we're saving consumers a massive amount of money. Yeah. Ross, one of the things that you and I have discovered when we've been on sites is that, in fact, when we ask for the validation of products that are being used, do the products comply with Australian standards, and the authentication of that, yes, is that we see shock and horror on the faces of people saying, well, gee, I don't know. Yes. And for the duration of our inspection, you can see the angst on their face so they can quickly scurry back to the office and find out whether it was or it wasn't. And of course, we're finding that there are many instances, in fact, of products being applied that do not meet Australian standards. Yes. And so I ran into one in the last 2 weeks where when I called in the authentication documents for the job, the certificates were from a manufacturer overseas who simply provided their in-house manufacturing claim for compliance.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with Australian standards.
Yes.
But very late in the piece, the product provider wanted in and said, oh, but I've got a CSIRO report that,
yes,
that you should take notice of that, because that will actually validate that particular product. And of course, I asked a bit about that, and I was told that, in fact, that test was done in 1980. So what we've also got to do is realise that currency is terribly important, because materials and assemblies and applications are all changing.
Yes.
So if anyone's got a certificate that's at any more than 5 years out of date, we will ignore it. You've got to keep your authentication, yes, up. So you and I are seeing that, in fact, very many times people don't know what they're using, they don't know what purpose they're using it for, yes, and they can't demonstrate that, in fact, it complies with anything.
Well, compliance is one issue, but coming to supply, it's amazing. Let's just take waterproofing as an example, which apply into other ones. So often that developer takes on, and then the builder then, in managing their risk, they think that they're managing their risk by bundling the waterproofing contract to a contractor who supplies the material. Now, the builder is not the least bit, hasn't got any allegiance or alliance with that supplier. The material could be the product that they had in the contract or another one. And almost every time we come back and look at film thickness, we find half the film thickness is there. So one of the ways around that in terms of accountability is for the builders to contract and buy the waterproofing membrane themselves, so they can check compliance. They can check, they have the supplier beholden to them for inspections, because in any case the contractor doesn't have any control over the formulation of the paint or the membrane. And then the builder can ensure that the right number of drums turn up and get used, or got a better idea.
Well, there's a number of ways of resolving that problem, but I'll give you an example on a job we went to with Bill Berger. Bill Berger actually built their wet area demonstration units down in the basement, yes, for the sole purposes of training the applicators of, on this job, you do it this way.
Yes.
They also then lined up on the shelf and said, these are the products you shall use on our job.
Lovely.
So their security guards stand around the perimeter of the job, and when a waterproofing membrane comes on job, as an example, they'll say, open up your boot, let's have a look. And they'll go through all their mastic guns, and they'll look at all their cans, and they'll say, right, in the bin with that, in the bin with that, in the bin with that. None of that's coming on this job. You know what comes on this job. Go away and come back.
Wonderful.
And bring that on board.
Yep. So that is a top-down kind of influence, isn't it? To say we're going to manage the risk in more intelligent ways.
Well, we know that some developers have suddenly realised that there's a real correlation between being sloppy at this front end and what it costs them down the back end. Now, I won't call out the developer, but there's one developer in Australia, one of the leaders, who may have been in a situation where, say, 5 years ago, the carry cost for provisioning on the balance sheet for defects in the buildings that they built was about $5,000 an apartment.
Right.
Now, they are building 1,000 apartments a year, so therefore that's quite a large impact on the balance sheet because that hangs around for at least 5 to 7 years. So that particular national manager of that product was really told by the board, you manage that latent cost of defects on an experience basis in our business down to the point where we can take provision for defects off our balance sheet.
Nice.
He tells me that he's got that down to $200 this year.
Wonderful. Great example.
Now, what you're there for is you see the real economic benefit to say suddenly you can free up the company's capital because you don't have all that capital tied up in all of these other problems. So you end up with a much more efficient use of capital.
So other industries are solving these problems in their own way. Are there examples from other industries that might be able to be applied here?
Ross, we've just heard about the fact that mining industry can have a situation where someone at the very top is responsible for everything that happens down the chain.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm talking about not just simply from a management responsibility, but also from a legal responsibility and ultimately a jail sentence for the wrong answer.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've got to really turn the industry's situation around is, say, in OH&S, in occupational health and safety, is that when you and I go and get inducted on a job site at the moment, we'll say, oh, how do we come on this job? And the site manager will say, oh, there's Fred, he's the safety manager, Fred will induct you. And in the mind of that site manager, he actually thinks that he's just simply passed the ball to Fred, and Fred's the man who's on the wire.
Yeah.
And I generally then ring the managing director of that company and say, I've just been through this experience where I expect you didn't even feel me being inducted on your job this morning. You didn't even feel that, in fact, you had responsibility for me.
Right. Yes.
So we're in the process of turning that around.
Yes.
If you've hired a certifier, then of course the certifier is going to get it right and nothing's going to slip through.
Yes.
It doesn't start there. It happens in those companies that manage their risks down from 5,000 apartments down to $200 an apartment. That's a systemic thing that is owned at every level of the organisation.
So cultural.
It is.
Yes. And the interesting thing was that huge change that we had in our industry 18 years ago when they then brought in individual accountability for safety, where everybody, instead of the Fred in the corner, every individual had shared in the overall accountability.
Well, we haven't really got to that. We really haven't achieved that yet. But there's a lot of people sort of scratching their head and saying, well, what level of culpability is ultimately management responsibility for? Now, I know that there's no way that a managing director can have their finger on every part of a site every day, but they've got to somehow work out how they're going to have that effect, because that goes through into the compliance of the things you and I are talking about. Do you get a good waterproofing outcome? Well, you know that the owner of the best developers in town, they can tell you the story about how their buildings come together. We know that in those well-regarded branded organisations, they have, this is the way this company does wet areas, this is the way our company. So when they engage an architect, they basically throw a book of details across the table and say, don't worry about inventing that for my project, just do something that we've done for 50 years and it works.
Yes. And the feedback mechanisms they have for correction are excellent.
And the way that they go about introducing an innovation, it's not as if a company, those sort of companies lock down innovation. They have a process for introducing innovation that says, well, show us how it's better than what we're doing. Let's do some investigations of that and prove that it really is better. And then we'll do a few of them and see how it goes.
And then feedback if it doesn't work.
If it doesn't work, take it out the back and shoot it. But,
that's right.
Look, that's where you see the things that have happened in food and mining and aeronautics and pharmaceuticals and in law, and look at the practice stuff that goes on in law. Look, there's not the barriers to resolving those things. Doctors used to bury their mistakes. The construction industry still does as well.
Thanks very much, David. I think that was really helpful in terms of getting a better understanding of how your office works, the approach you're taking and the impact that you're making. I think the viewers will get a lot out of that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Good to be with you.